Hey guys, tonight, we're stepping away from the marble palaces, powerful emperors, and famous battles of ancient Rome, and entering a place where ordinary Romans spent their evenings, a place hidden between the crowded streets and narrow alleyways of the empire, the Roman Tavern. When most people imagine ancient Rome, they picture grand monuments, armies marching across Europe, and wealthy citizens wearing expensive clothing. But after sunset, another side of Rome appeared, workers who had spent the entire day building the empire finally looked for a place to rest, soldiers gathered after long journeys, travelers searched for food and shelter, merchants exchanged stories. And ordinary people sat together inside small, crowded taverns filled with the smell of roasted food, spilled wine, smoke from oil lamps, and endless conversations. But these places were not always peaceful. Behind the laughter and music were arguments, gambling, suspicious deals, and moments that revealed the complicated reality of Roman society, because a Roman tavern was not just a place to drink, it was where people met, where information spread, where friendships were created, where strangers from across the empire could sit at the same table. Tonight, we'll walk through the streets of ancient Rome after dark, we'll open the wooden doors of a Roman tavern, we'll discover what people ate, what they drank, who visited these places, what conversations filled the rooms, and what it was truly like to spend an evening there nearly 2,000 years ago. So get comfortable, relax, and let's travel back to the Roman Empire, not to the world of emperors and warriors, but to the hidden nighttime world of ordinary people, because sometimes the most interesting stories of history are not found inside palaces, but inside the small places where everyday people lived, laughed, and survived. The last traces of daylight slowly disappear behind rows of tiled rooftops. The warm glow of the setting sun fades into shades of violet and deep blue, leaving the streets of Rome illuminated by flickering oil lamps that dance gently against worn stone walls. The city does not fall silent, it simply changes its rhythm. The busy markets that echoed with bargaining voices throughout the afternoon begin to empty. Wooden stalls are covered for the night. Merchants count their remaining coins before disappearing into narrow lanes. Somewhere nearby, a mule shakes its harness while a cart creaks over uneven paving stones. The air carries countless scents at once, fresh bread cooling in nearby bakeries, charcoal from evening fires, herbs drifting from kitchen windows, damp stone still holding the warmth of the day, and, somewhere ahead, the unmistakable aroma of wine. You walk carefully across polished basalt streets made smooth by generations of passing feet. Rainwater collected earlier in shallow grooves reflects the trembling light of hanging lamps. Every reflection feels almost alive. Around you, Rome reveals a different personality. Without the blinding sun, faces become softer. Voices lower into relaxed conversations. The city's towering apartment buildings lean over the streets like silent observers, their upper windows glowing with tiny points of golden light. A woman calls her children inside before darkness settles completely. A baker locks his heavy wooden door. Two laborious, their tunics stained with dust, laugh quietly as they head toward the same destination, not home, the tavern. For many Romans, home offered little comfort. Entire families often shared cramped rooms high above noisy streets. Cooking inside these crowded apartments could be dangerous, and warm meals were not always guaranteed. A tavern offered something simple, light, company, warmth, and the comforting feeling of belonging somewhere, even if only for a single evening. As you continue walking, the streets become narrower. The grand temples and official buildings slowly disappear behind twisting alleys where everyday life continues unnoticed by history's greatest storytellers. Cats slip silently between Storage jars, a stray dog curls beside a doorway, a watchman passes carrying a lantern, its flame swaying gently with every careful step. From somewhere ahead comes the soft sound of laughter, then another, a wooden cup taps against a table, someone begins humming a familiar tune. The heavy wooden door closes softly behind you, almost at once. The cool evening air disappears, replaced by a comforting warmth that settles gently around your shoulders. The sounds of the street fade into the distance, muffled by thick walls built to withstand countless seasons. Inside, another world quietly unfolds, one measured not by the movement of the sun, but by conversation, shared meals, and the slow passing of the evening. For a moment, your eyes need time to adjust. The room is lit by small oil lamps hanging from iron hooks and resting upon rough wooden tables. Their flames sway ever so slightly whenever the door opens, casting long shadows that drift across plastered walls darkened by years of smoke. Nothing here is polished to perfection. Every beam overhead bears the marks of age. Every stone beneath your feet has been worn smooth by generations of sandals crossing the same floor. The tavern is smaller than you might have imagined. No grand hall welcomes wealthy guests. Instead, low ceilings create a sense of closeness, almost as though everyone inside has become part of the same quiet story. The furniture is simple: sturdy benches, heavy stools, broad tables scarred with countless scratches left by cups, knives, and idle hands passing the hours. Near the entrance, cloaks hang from wooden pegs, still damp from the cool evening outside. A traveler carefully removes dust from his sandals before joining companions already waiting with warm cups in their hands. The air itself feels alive. Roasted onions mingle with fresh herbs. Thick barley stew bubbles gently in a clay pot somewhere beyond a curtain leading toward the kitchen. Freshly baked bread releases its familiar warmth into the room, while the sharp sweetness of wine lingers beneath it all. Smoke from nearby lamps curls lazily toward the rafters before disappearing into the darkness above. You begin to notice the quieter details. A small terracotta cup has been repaired so many times that its cracks form delicate patterns. A woven basket overflows with coarse loaves waiting for hungry customers. An old bronze coin rests forgotten beneath the edge of a table, unnoticed by everyone except perhaps the little mouse that cautiously emerges from a corner before quickly retreating again. The conversations around you rise and fall like gentle waves. Nobody rushes to fill every silence. One table discusses tomorrow's work repairing roads beyond the city walls. At another, two merchants quietly compare the prices of olive oil arriving from distant provinces. An elderly man listens more than he speaks, smiling faintly as younger voices carry the evening forward. Occasionally, laughter ripples across the room before fading once more into comfortable conversation. This is not the loud celebration often imagined in stories of ancient nightlife. Most evenings were remarkably ordinary. People came here because ordinary life itself was exhausting, after hours spent lifting stone, shaping iron, carrying grain, or traveling dusty roads. Even a modest bench beside familiar faces could feel like a luxury. Against one wall stands a shelf lined with clay jugs of different sizes. Some contain watered wine prepared for daily drinking. Others hold vinegar mixed with water, a refreshing drink for those seeking something lighter after long hours of labor. Wooden ladles rest neatly beside them, polished smooth through years of steady use. Nearby, an old dog sleeps peacefully beneath a table, barely lifting an ear as customers pass. No one seems bothered by its presence. Like the smoke-blackened beams overhead, it simply belongs here. You notice that people greet one another with easy familiarity. Not everyone knows each other's names, yet many recognize familiar faces: the carpenter who arrives every third evening, the messenger returning from the northern roads, the fisherman bringing news from the coast. Their lives briefly overlap inside these walls before continuing once again into the wider empire. The tavern feels less like a business and more like a temporary home built from shared routines. Outside, Rome stretches across hills and valleys, crowded with nearly 1 million lives, each carrying private hopes, worries, and burdens. Inside this single room, those burdens grow just a little lighter. No emperor enters tonight, no senator commands attention. Here, status softens beneath the quiet comfort of warm food, steady light, and simple companionship. As another customer gently pushes open the wooden door, cool night air slips inside for only a heartbeat before disappearing again. You realize the evening has only just begun. The room is slowly filling, and with every newcomer who finds a place at the table, another piece of the Roman world quietly reveals itself. Soon, you will discover exactly who those people are, and why so many different lives crossed paths beneath this humble roof. The room grows a little fuller, not all at once, but gradually, as though the city itself is exhaling after another long day. Each time the wooden door opens, a brief gust of cool night air slips inside before vanishing into the warmth. New faces appear in the gentle glow of the oil lamps, and with them comes another small piece of Rome's enormous story. At first glance, the people seem ordinary, and that is exactly what makes this place remarkable. History often remembers emperors, senators, and victorious generals. Their names were carved into marble and preserved in grand speeches. But inside a Roman tavern, those celebrated figures were rarely the center of attention. Instead, the room belonged to the countless ordinary people whose names have long since disappeared, the very people who kept the empire alive. A stonemason enters first. Fine white dust still clings to his rough hands and simple wool tunic. He has spent the day shaping blocks of limestone beneath the relentless Mediterranean sun. His shoulders ache, and his palms carry the memory of every hammer strike. Tonight, he asks for nothing extravagant, only a warm drink, a seat near familiar faces, and a few quiet hours before tomorrow begins. Not long after, two dock workers arrive together. Their sandals are damp from the riverbank, and the scent of fresh water follows them indoors. They speak softly about shipments delayed by changing winds, about grain barges from distant provinces, and about whether tomorrow's work will be easier than today's. Their conversation drifts gently through the room before blending with dozens of others. Near the back sits a merchant. Unlike the laborers, his hands are smooth, but his mind is rarely at rest. Small leather pouches filled with carefully counted coins rest beside him on the table. He has traveled roads stretching far beyond Rome itself, carrying olive oil, cloth, spices, or pottery between bustling towns. Every journey has brought new faces, unfamiliar languages, and stories worth remembering. The tavern offers him something the road cannot: stillness. Then the door opens again. A soldier quietly steps inside. His cloak bears the dust of many miles, and his boots have walked roads built by the empire itself. Yet here, away from the discipline of military camps, he simply becomes another customer. He removes his travel pack, stretches tired muscles, and smiles politely as someone offers him a place at the crowded table. No one asks him to recount glorious battles. Instead, they ask a far more human question: how long have you been traveling? Sometimes that single question begins an evening of remarkable stories. Across the room sits an elderly man who visits nearly every evening. Age has slowed his steps but sharpened his memory. Younger customers often pause to hear him describe neighborhoods that looked different decades ago, before new buildings rose or old shops disappeared. Whether every detail is perfectly accurate hardly matters. His stories have become part of the tavern itself. Even travelers passing through Rome find comfort here. Some have crossed mountains, others have sailed across restless seas, many know no one in the city. For them, the warm glow behind these wooden walls offers reassurance that, for one evening at least, they are not entirely alone. Not everyone comes to speak. One young craftsman quietly eats his supper while listening to conversations unfolding around him. A messenger studies tomorrow's route in silence. A widow enjoys a simple meal before returning home, grateful for a place where no one expects lengthy conversation. The tavern welcomes many different personalities. Some seek companionship, others seek only a little peace. You notice something else as the evening deepens. Clothing hints at occupation, but not always at wealth. A patched cloak may belong to a respected carpenter. A cleaner tunic may hide heavy debts. Inside these walls, appearances become less important than shared humanity. The conversations themselves travel farther than many people ever will. News from the northern frontier reaches merchants before official announcements. Harvest rumors spread alongside weather predictions. Someone speaks of unusual prices in a nearby market. Another mentions repairs to a distant road. Information moves from table to table as naturally as the wine. In many ways, the tavern becomes the city's living newspaper. No written notice could travel as quickly as curious voices gathered around warm cups after sunset. As you quietly observe the room, it becomes clear that this humble tavern is a crossroads of the Roman world. Farmers, craftsmen, sailors, traders, soldiers, messengers, and neighbors all pause beneath the same roof, if only for a few peaceful hours. They arrive as strangers, many leave as familiar faces, and now that you know who fills these benches each evening, your attention begins to drift toward the wooden platters emerging from the kitchen, carrying the comforting aromas of an ordinary Roman supper. As another wave of quiet conversation settles across the room, something else begins to capture your attention, not the voices, not the laughter, but the comforting aroma drifting from the little kitchen hidden behind a simple linen curtain. It arrives slowly, carried on the warm air. The scent of fresh bread mingles with roasted garlic, fragrant herbs, simmering lentils, and the rich smell of onions softening over glowing coals. After a long day of walking through Rome's streets, you suddenly understand why so many people found their way here before returning home. The food was never meant to impress, it was meant to satisfy. A young servant carefully emerges from the kitchen, balancing several rough wooden platters with practiced ease. No two meals look exactly alike, but they all share one thing in common: they are honest meals, simple ingredients, prepared with care. The first thing placed upon nearly every table is bread, not the soft white loaves reserved for wealthy households, but coarse, dark bread made from barley or wheat, its crust thick and firm from the stone ovens of nearby bakeries. Fresh from the day's baking, it still carries a comforting warmth. Some customers tear it apart with their hands, while others dip it into broth until it softens. No meal feels complete without it. Beside the bread comes a humble bowl of lentil stew. The thick mixture bubbles gently. Flavored with onions, leeks, garlic, coriander, and whatever vegetables happen to be available that season. Every tavern has its own version. Some cooks make it heartier than others, but each bowl offers the same quiet promise. You will leave less hungry than when you arrived. Soon another platter appears: salted olives. Their deep green and dark purple skins glisten faintly beneath the oil lamps. Small dishes of cheese accompany them, often made from sheep's or goat's milk, firm enough to slice yet soft enough to spread across warm bread. A handful of dried figs rests nearby, adding a welcome sweetness that balances the salt. The meal is modest, yet nothing feels rushed. A cook steps from behind the curtain to stir a heavy clay pot hanging above glowing charcoal. The fire crackles softly beneath it, filling the room with gentle warmth rather than unbearable heat. Every movement suggests long experience rather than hurried effort. Meat appears less often than many people imagine. For ordinary Romans, it is something enjoyed occasionally rather than every evening. When available, it might be roasted pork, small pieces of chicken, or simple sausages seasoned with herbs. The portions are not large. They do not need to be. Meat serves as a welcome addition, not the center of the meal. Fish, however, is more common, depending on the season and the tavern's location. Grilled river fish or preserved seafood may find its way onto the table. Along the nearby coasts, fresh catches arrive more easily. Farther inland, salted fish keeps well during long journeys. One familiar flavor appears again and again: garum. This famous Roman fish sauce is poured sparingly over vegetables, meat, and stews. Its powerful aroma surprises newcomers, yet many Romans consider it essential. A few careful drops transform an ordinary dish into something richer, carrying the taste of the sea into nearly every corner of the empire. Fresh herbs brighten even the simplest meal: parsley, dill, mint, thyme. A cook scatters them across warm dishes with practiced hands, adding fragrance as much as flavor. You notice something quietly reassuring: nobody here eats alone unless they choose to. Bread is passed from one person to another without ceremony. Someone offers a handful of olives across the table. A traveler receives an extra slice of cheese after admitting he has spent the entire day on the road. Small acts of generosity seem almost expected. There are no elaborate courses arriving one after another, no polished silver serving trays, no grand banquets, only steady nourishment shared beneath soft lamplight. The meal unfolds at the same gentle pace as the evening itself. Between each bite, conversations continue, stories are told, advice is exchanged, silences are welcomed. The food fills more than empty stomachs. It creates a reason to remain. As the last pieces of bread disappear and clay bowls slowly empty, servants begin clearing the tables with quiet efficiency. They replace finished platters with freshly filled cups, and almost without noticing, the focus of the evening begins to shift. The comforting warmth of the meal gives way to something that lingers even longer: the drink resting quietly inside every Roman cup. The last wooden platter disappears into the kitchen. For a brief moment, the table seems strangely quiet. Empty bowls and scattered crumbs tell the story of satisfying meals, while the warm scent of roasted herbs slowly fades into the background. Yet the evening is far from over. In fact, for many Romans, it is only now beginning. A tavern servant makes another slow journey around the room, this time carrying not food, but heavy clay jugs. Their rounded sides catch the flickering glow of the oil lamps, and with every careful step, you hear the gentle slosh of liquid inside. One by one, cups are filled. The sound is soft, almost soothing. Wine trickles into coarse earthenware cups, its deep red color shimmering briefly before settling into stillness. No one rushes to drink. The first sip often comes after another sentence, another story, another thoughtful pause. Wine was the heartbeat of Roman tavern life, but perhaps not in the way many people imagine. If you expected overflowing goblets filled with strong, undiluted wine, you might be surprised. Most Romans rarely drank wine at full strength. Instead, they mixed it carefully with water. To modern ears, this may sound unusual, even disappointing. Yet to the Romans, drinking unmixed wine was often considered uncivilized, a habit associated with excess rather than refinement. Diluting wine softened its strength, allowing conversations to stretch peacefully across the evening without quickly descending into disorder. Every tavern had its own preferred balance. Some mixed 1 part wine with 2 parts water, others added even more. The choice depended on the quality of the wine, the preferences of the customers, and sometimes simply how generous the tavern keeper wished to be. The water itself was often cool, drawn from public fountains or nearby aqueducts earlier in the day. Mixed together inside large clay vessels, the drink became lighter, smoother, and suitable for long evenings among friends. You notice that not every cup contains wine. One elderly customer quietly sips a drink made from watered vinegar, known throughout the Roman world as a refreshing companion for workers and travelers. Its sharp taste awakens tired senses after long hours beneath the sun, while costing far less than fine wine nearby. Another guest enjoys a cup flavored gently with herbs. Mint leaves float lazily across the surface. The fragrance rises softly each time the cup is lifted. Even simple drinks could offer small moments of comfort. The tavern keeper moves steadily between tables. Years of practice allow him to refill cups without interrupting conversations. He listens more than he speaks, quietly remembering which customers prefer stronger mixtures, which travelers count every coin, and which regular visitors always linger long after the final serving. Hospitality is measured not by extravagance, but by attentiveness. Across the room, a merchant raises his cup toward a soldier who has just finished describing the roads beyond the Alps. There is no elaborate toast, no loud celebration, only a simple gesture of respect. Elsewhere, 2 craftsmen pause their discussion to share a quiet drink in companionable silence. Their words are few now. The drink itself has become part of the conversation. The cups are beautifully ordinary. Most are made from fired clay, their surfaces rough beneath the fingers. Some bear simple painted lines. Others have tiny imperfections left by the potter's hands decades earlier. Each cup feels personal, used, trusted. A few wealthier visitors occasionally carry finely crafted metal cups while traveling, but inside this tavern, such displays attract little attention. Practicality matters far more than appearance. As the evening deepens, the pace of drinking remains remarkably slow. No one seems eager to empty a cup simply to fill it again. Instead, every sip stretches time, stories grow longer, silences become more comfortable. Outside, the streets continue to darken beneath the Roman sky, while inside, the warm glow of the lamps reflects gently across rows of quiet faces. Perhaps this is the true purpose of the drink, not escape, not forgetfulness, but connection. A shared cup creates space for strangers to become acquaintances, and acquaintances to become friends. The worries carried in from the street seem just a little lighter when held beside warm conversation and steady company. You lift your own cup, the clay feels pleasantly warm in your hands. The watered wine carries gentle notes of fruit, softened by cool water and the passing hours. It is simple, unpretentious, entirely suited to this modest place. Around you, laughter rises once more, not loud enough to disturb the peace, but warm enough to remind everyone that even ordinary evenings could leave lasting memories. And before long, as the cups continue to circle the room, the conversations begin to reveal what a truly normal night inside a Roman tavern actually felt like. The cups are no longer empty. Freshly poured wine rests quietly beside every meal, and the steady rhythm of the tavern settles into something wonderfully familiar. There is no grand performance announcing that the evening has truly begun. It happens so gently that you almost miss it. The conversations simply become longer, the pauses become more comfortable, and strangers slowly become part of the same shared night. You find a place along one of the worn wooden benches, close enough to hear the room without becoming the center of anyone's attention. It is perhaps the best place to understand a Roman tavern, not through the walls or the food, but through the people who fill it with life. At the nearest table, for laborers sit shoulder to shoulder. Their hands are rough with calluses earned from lifting stone, cutting timber, and repairing roads. Throughout the day, their conversations would have been brief, interrupted by the demands of work. Here, however, time belongs to them again. One man tells a story about a stubborn mule that refused to cross a bridge, another insists the animal was wiser than its owner. The table erupts into quiet laughter, not the loud, roaring laughter of celebration, but the gentle kind that comes from familiar friendships. Across the room, a pair of merchants compare the journeys they completed before arriving in Rome. One speaks of dusty roads winding through distant hills. The other recalls a crowded harbor where ships arrived carrying grain, pottery, and spices from every corner of the Mediterranean. Their stories travel farther than most of the people listening ever will. For a few moments, everyone at the table visits those distant places through simple conversation alone. Near the fire, an elderly customer slowly carves a small piece of wood while listening to younger voices nearby. He rarely interrupts. Every now and then, someone asks his opinion. When he finally speaks, the room grows just a little quieter. Years have given his words a quiet weight, not because he is wealthy, not because he holds power, simply because he has lived long enough to watch Rome change. You notice something remarkable. Nobody seems to hurry. In the modern world, meals often end as quickly as they begin. Here, the evening unfolds patiently. A single cup of watered wine may last an hour. One story naturally invites another. Silence itself feels welcome. Even the tavern keeper understands this rhythm. He wipes tables slowly, refills lamps before they burn too low, and quietly adds fresh wood to the glowing charcoal fire. His movements blend into the background so completely that many customers hardly notice him, yet without his careful attention, the evening would lose its gentle balance. Occasionally, the wooden door opens, a traveler steps inside, someone leaves with a grateful nod. Life flows steadily through the tavern like the river beyond the city walls. No dramatic entrance changes the room. Every visitor simply becomes another thread woven into the night's quiet tapestry. In one corner, two friends play a guessing game. One hides a small pebble inside a closed hand while the other tries to guess which hand holds it. The reward is nothing more than a smile and good-natured teasing. Nearby, a young apprentice listens carefully as an older craftsman explains how to recognize strong oak from weaker timber simply by its scent and grain. Lessons are shared as naturally as bread. Knowledge passes from one generation to the next without anyone calling it education. Children are rare inside taverns this late in the evening, but now and then one appears beside a parent collecting supper to take home. The child watches the room with wide, curious eyes before disappearing once more into the cool streets outside. For a brief moment, you wonder how many future memories begin in places exactly like this, not during festivals, not in palaces, but on ordinary evenings surrounded by ordinary people. The lamps burn a little lower now. Outside, the streets have grown quieter. Inside, conversations soften into comfortable murmurs. No one feels the need to fill every silence. The tavern has become something more than a place to eat or drink. It has become a refuge from the demands of the day, a place where worries lose their sharp edges, a place where loneliness becomes a little lighter, a place where time itself seems to move more slowly. As you sit quietly, listening to the gentle chorus of voices blending with the crackling fire and the occasional clink of clay cups, you begin to realize that the true heartbeat of a Roman tavern was never found in its walls. It was found in the people who welcomed one another, night after night, and behind those familiar conversations, unnoticed by many guests. Another group quietly keeps the entire evening alive, the men and women working behind the counter, whose stories are just beginning to emerge. The voices of the guests drift gently through the tavern, stories continue to pass from one table to another, cups are quietly refilled, and somewhere near the hearth another loaf of bread is sliced with practiced hands. To most visitors, the evening appears effortless, as though the tavern simply comes alive on its own each night. But every warm meal, every glowing lamp, every clean cup resting on a wooden table, exists because someone has been working long before the first customer arrived. As your attention slowly shifts away from the guests, another side of the tavern begins to reveal itself. Behind the linen curtain, hidden from most conversations, stands the cook. The room is warmer here. The glow of charcoal fills the small kitchen with a steady orange light, while clay pots simmer patiently over low fires. Steam rises slowly, carrying the familiar scents of garlic, onions, herbs, and fresh bread into the dining room. The cook moves with quiet confidence. There is no wasted motion. One hand stirs a pot of lentils while the other checks a loaf resting inside a stone oven. A few sprigs of thyme are added almost without thought. Years of repetition have turned each movement into instinct. Few customers know the cook's name, yet many return because of these simple meals. Nearby, a young assistant kneads another batch of dough upon a flour-covered table. Fine white dust clings to both hands and sleeves, while the rhythm of pressing, folding, and turning the dough continues almost like quiet music. Outside, people measure time by conversation. Inside the kitchen, time is measured by rising bread and slowly simmering stew. Closer to the entrance stands the tavern keeper. Unlike the cook, the keeper rarely remains in one place for long. He welcomes newcomers with a gentle nod, remembers familiar faces, keeps careful count of clay cups and bronze coins, settles small disagreements before they grow into larger ones. His work is as much about people as it is about food. Some evenings he hears news from provinces hundreds of miles away. Other nights he quietly comforts a traveler who has arrived exhausted after weeks on unfamiliar roads. A successful tavern depends as much upon trust as it does upon good cooking. Behind another doorway, stacked neatly against the wall, stand dozens of clay amphorae. Each one contains part of the tavern's livelihood: wine, olive oil, grain, salted fish, dried beans. The keeper checks them carefully. A careless inventory could leave tomorrow's customers hungry. Every loaf served tonight must somehow become another loaf tomorrow. The work never truly ends. As one servant clears empty bowls, another lights fresh oil lamps before the older flames begin to fade. Their movements are so quiet that many guests scarcely notice them passing between crowded benches, yet the entire evening depends upon their constant attention. One servant pauses briefly beside an elderly customer, gently replacing a cracked cup before it spills. Another carries heavy water jars from the courtyard well. The weight strains tired shoulders, but no complaint escapes her lips. She simply returns for another journey. Outside these walls, history often celebrates powerful rulers and famous generals. Inside the tavern, history belongs just as much to those whose names were never recorded: the women baking bread before sunrise, the young boys sweeping ash from yesterday's fires, the aging servant polishing clay cups late into the night after every customer has gone home. Their labor quietly shaped countless ordinary evenings. You notice how carefully everyone works together. the cook calls for more herbs before supplies run low, a servant brings them without a word, the tavern keeper notices fresh travelers entering and quickly prepares another table. Years of shared routine have created a rhythm almost invisible to outsiders. No one needs to raise their voice, everyone already understands their part. As the night grows later, fatigue begins to settle across the workers' faces. They have been awake far longer than most of their guests, long after the final conversation ends, long after the last cup has been washed. Tomorrow's preparations will quietly begin once again. Perhaps that is the hidden secret of every Roman tavern. The customers remember the warmth, the laughter, the food, the companionship, but beneath every peaceful evening stood countless unseen hands working patiently behind the scenes, asking for little more than another honest day's wage. The guests may come and go, yet these workers remain, night after night, keeping the tavern alive with quiet dedication. And as you watch them disappear back into the gentle glow of the kitchen, you begin to understand why so many Romans returned here again and again, not only for the meals or the wine, but for the comforting feeling that someone was always waiting to welcome them back. The kitchen grows quieter as the evening settles into its gentlest hours. Most of the cooking is finished now. Fresh loaves have already been served, the largest pots are slowly emptying, and the workers move with an unhurried rhythm. Yet the tavern itself remains comfortably alive. No one seems eager to leave. Outside, the streets of Rome have become cooler. A light breeze wanders through the narrow alleys, carrying the distant bark of a dog, the faint clatter of a cart returning home, and the soft echo of footsteps fading into the darkness. Inside, however, another kind of warmth still lingers. It is not simply the warmth of the charcoal fire, nor the warmth of the wine. It is the warmth of belonging. For many ordinary Romans, this feeling was surprisingly rare. Home was not always the peaceful refuge we often imagine today. Much of Rome's population lived inside tall apartment buildings known as insulae. Many families occupied only a single small room. Several generations might sleep beneath one roof, surrounded by neighbors separated by little more than thin walls and creaking wooden floors. Privacy was a luxury. Quiet was even rarer. After spending an exhausting day working in crowded streets, workshops, or markets, returning home did not always mean finding rest. Sometimes the tavern offered something home could not: space to breathe. You watch a carpenter settle comfortably onto the same bench he has occupied for years. No one had reserved it for him. No sign bears his name, yet everyone knows it is where he likes to sit. Across the room, a widow receives a gentle greeting from the tavern keeper before quietly taking her usual place near the hearth. She orders only a small cup of watered wine, but she stays for nearly an hour, listening to the familiar voices around her. She rarely joins the conversations. She simply enjoys being surrounded by them. In a city as enormous as Rome, it was entirely possible to feel invisible. The tavern gently pushed back against that loneliness. A newcomer might arrive without knowing a single person. By the end of the evening, someone had usually offered directions, shared a story, or recommended a trustworthy baker, blacksmith, or place to sleep. These small kindnesses rarely appeared in history books. Yet they quietly shaped everyday life. The tavern also offered something that money alone could not easily purchase: routine. Every evening unfolded with comforting familiarity. The lamps were lit, the bread arrived, the cups were filled, the same friendly faces appeared, one after another, until the room felt almost like an extended family gathered beneath a shared roof. Human beings have always found comfort in familiar rhythms. The Romans were no different. you notice that even silence feels welcome here. No one expects constant entertainment. Some customers simply watch the fire dance across glowing charcoal. Others stare thoughtfully into their cups while listening to distant conversations drift gently through the room. No one rushes them, no one asks why they have grown quiet. The silence belongs to everyone. The tavern becomes a place where people can simply exist without needing to explain themselves. Perhaps that is why these humble establishments survived for centuries. They answered needs far deeper than hunger or thirst. They offered recognition, comfort, community, even hope. A young messenger enters just before the door is closed against the night air. He is clearly unfamiliar with this neighborhood. Within moments, another customer slides over, making room on the crowded bench. No invitation is spoken, none is necessary. The gesture says enough. Sit, rest, you are welcome here. The messenger smiles with visible relief. After days spent traveling unfamiliar roads, that simple act may become the memory he carries longest from Rome. The tavern keeper notices the exchange but says nothing. He has witnessed scenes like this countless times. They are part of the quiet rhythm that gives the tavern its soul. As the fire settles into glowing embers, the conversations soften even further. Some guests prepare to leave, others decide to remain just a little longer. No one seems eager for the evening to end. For a few precious hours, the burdens waiting outside these walls have become easier to carry. Tomorrow will bring another day's labor, another journey, another uncertainty. But tonight there is warm light, friendly voices, and the comforting certainty that, inside this modest room, no one has to face the evening entirely alone. Yet like every gathering place where people seek comfort, the tavern also carried another reputation. For not every visitor came searching for peace, and not every night ended as quietly as this one. The fire has burned lower now, its bright flames have settled into glowing embers, painting the room with softer shades of amber and gold. Many of the evening's earliest visitors have already made their way home, disappearing into the cool Roman night with quiet farewells. Yet not everyone leaves. As the hour grows later, the tavern begins to change once again, not dramatically, not all at once, simply, little by little. The conversations become more private. New faces appear that were nowhere to be seen earlier in the evening. Some enter with familiar smiles. Others pause at the doorway, carefully studying the room before stepping inside. The tavern remains welcoming. But now, another side of its personality slowly begins to emerge. Roman taverns were places where almost anyone could enter. That openness made them lively. It also made them unpredictable. A traveler arriving after midnight might sit beside an honest craftsman, or beside someone hoping to earn a few extra coins through less honorable means. You notice a man seated alone near the darkest corner of the room. His hood remains pulled low, though the night outside is not especially cold. Every few minutes another customer quietly approaches his table. Their conversations are brief. A few bronze coins change hands. No voices are raised. No one asks questions. The tavern keeper notices. He simply continues polishing clay cups. Some things are better left unseen. Nearby, two strangers begin discussing a game of chance. A handful of small carved dice appears on the table almost as if by magic. They roll softly across worn wood with a pleasant clicking sound. At first, both players smile. The wagers are tiny, a single coin, then another, nothing unusual. Yet as the game continues, the atmosphere changes almost too slowly to notice. One player begins gripping his cup more tightly. The other studies every roll with growing suspicion. Around them, conversations continue as though nothing has happened. This is not the first disagreement these walls have witnessed, nor will it. be the last. Roman authorities often viewed taverns with quiet concern, not because every tavern encouraged trouble, but because large gatherings of strangers always carried uncertainty. News traveled quickly here, so did rumors. Political gossip passed from one table to another with remarkable speed, sometimes changing slightly each time it was repeated. A careless sentence spoken over wine could spread across entire neighborhoods before sunrise. The tavern was, in many ways, the empire's unofficial meeting place. That made it valuable. It also made it difficult to control. The tavern keeper understands this balance better than anyone. He keeps one eye upon the entrance, the other upon his customers. When voices begin rising, he quietly walks closer. Often, his presence alone is enough: a calm word, a gentle reminder, a fresh cup placed between frustrated hands. Most disagreements end before they truly begin. After all, few people wish to lose the comfort of a familiar tavern. Outside, the streets themselves remain uncertain after dark. The glow of oil lamps reaches only so far. Beyond their light, narrow alleys twist between tall apartment buildings where shadows gather naturally. Travelers unfamiliar with the neighborhood often choose to remain inside the tavern until dawn rather than risk wandering through streets they do not know. Safety, like warmth, becomes another service the tavern quietly provides. You glance toward the doorway. A young messenger carefully counts the few coins remaining in his purse before paying for one final cup. He checks twice. Every coin matters. Petty theft was hardly unknown in a city as large as Rome. A careless pocket could become noticeably lighter before morning. Inside, most guests watch over one another without making a great show of it. A neighbor quietly warns another that his purse has slipped toward the edge of the bench. A traveler notices an elderly customer struggling to stand and offers an arm without hesitation. The darker side of tavern life existed, but so did quiet acts of decency. The two often lived side by side beneath the same roof. Eventually, the dice game comes to an end. One player sighs, the other gathers the small winnings with neither celebration nor pride. The tension fades as quickly as it arrived. Someone changes the subject. A fresh story begins. The room exhales once more. Perhaps that is the greatest surprise. Roman taverns were never places of constant danger, as later legends sometimes suggest. Nor were they perfectly peaceful gathering halls. They were something far more human. Places where kindness and temptation, generosity and suspicion, laughter and disappointment could all exist within the same quiet evening. As the final lamps flicker against smoke-darkened walls, you begin to understand that spending a single night here meant accepting every possibility the evening might bring, and before long, you will discover exactly what it truly felt like to remain inside these walls until the first light of morning. The last game of dice has ended. The final wager has been tucked away. The quiet disagreements have dissolved into tired smiles, and one by one, the guests who arrived earliest step back into the sleeping streets of Rome. The heavy wooden door opens only occasionally now, each movement allowing a breath of cool night air to slip inside before warmth gently claims the room once again. You decide to stay, not for another cup of wine, not for another meal, simply to experience what an entire Roman night might truly have felt like. You settle deeper onto the sturdy wooden bench. It is not especially comfortable by modern standards. The wood is firm beneath you, polished smooth by countless generations of travelers, workers, and merchants who have rested here before. Yet after hours spent walking Rome's uneven streets, even this simple seat begins to feel surprisingly welcoming. The tavern has changed again. Earlier in the evening, voices filled every corner of the room. Now they drift softly through the warm air like distant echoes. Conversations have become quieter, slower, almost dreamlike. Nobody feels rushed. The tavern keeper no longer moves quickly between tables. Instead, he pauses beside familiar customers for a few moments before quietly refilling a lamp or adding another small piece of wood to the glowing charcoal fire. The flames barely crackle now, they simply glow. Outside, Rome sleeps unevenly. Some neighborhoods remain awake with the sounds of late arrivals and distant footsteps, while others have surrendered completely to silence. From somewhere beyond the tavern walls comes the faint bark of a dog. A cart rolls slowly across worn paving stones before disappearing into the distance. Then, nothing, only stillness. Inside, the air carries familiar scents that have settled into the old wooden beams over many years: smoke, fresh bread, olive oil, wine, charcoal, the faint sweetness of dried figs left forgotten on a nearby platter. Every breath reminds you that this place has welcomed thousands of evenings just like this one. You glance around the room. A traveler has fallen asleep with his arms folded across the table, his rolled cloak serving as a pillow. No one disturbs him. Tomorrow will bring another long journey, and tonight's peaceful rest is worth more than anyone's complaint. Near the hearth, an elderly regular quietly watches the embers. Perhaps he is thinking about family. Perhaps he is remembering younger days. Or perhaps he simply enjoys watching the slow dance of fading firelight across the stones. Not every silence needs an explanation. A servant gently sweeps crumbs from the floor. The soft sound of straw brushing against stone blends almost perfectly with the gentle murmur of distant conversation. Somewhere behind the curtain, someone carefully stacks freshly washed clay bowls. The work continues quietly, almost invisibly. Hours seem to lose their meaning here, without clocks, without glowing screens, without the constant demands of modern life. The night unfolds according to simpler rhythms. A lamp burns lower. Someone yawns. Another guest quietly stands, thanks the keeper with a nod, and disappears into the darkness outside. Nothing dramatic happens, and somehow, that is exactly what makes the experience feel so real. Most nights in ancient Rome were not filled with extraordinary adventures. They were filled with ordinary moments that history rarely records. A shared smile or a warm drink, the comfort of familiar voices, the relief of resting tired feet after a demanding day. You begin to notice how deeply connected every small detail has become. The worn table beneath your hands, the uneven stone floor, the smoke-darkened rafters above, the clay cup still holding the final sip of watered wine. Together, they create a feeling that is strangely timeless. For a little while, the concerns of tomorrow seem very far away. You understand why so. Many Romans returned here evening after evening, not because every night promised excitement, but because most nights promise something far more valuable: peace, as the first faint hint of cooler air announces that dawn is still hours away. The tavern grows quieter than it has been all evening. Only a handful of guests remain. The lamps flicker gently, the embers glow softly. The city beyond the walls sleeps beneath the stars, and for one ordinary night, nearly 2,000 years ago, you have shared the same quiet shelter as craftsmen, travelers, widows, merchants, soldiers, and neighbors whose names history has forgotten, yet whose lives were every bit as real as our own. Soon, as another evening in Rome slowly comes to an end, you will discover that even after the meals were finished and the wine had been poured, people still found gentle ways to pass the hours, with games that revealed another quiet side of life inside the Roman tavern. The tavern has entered its quietest rhythm. Most guests have already eaten, most conversations have softened, and the glow of the oil lamps now feels lower, warmer, almost hypnotic. Outside, Rome continues its slow breathing, some streets awake, others already surrendered to sleep, But inside these walls, a different kind of energy begins to surface, not louder, not brighter, just more focused. It begins with something small, a hand reaching into a pocket, a few carved objects placed gently onto a wooden table, dice, simple, worn cubes of bone or stone, marked with dark dots that have been smoothed by years of use. They are unremarkable to look at, yet in Roman taverns, they carry a strange power. They turn ordinary evenings into moments of anticipation. At one table, two men lean closer. A merchant and a dock worker. Their conversation has shifted. Words have become fewer. Attention has narrowed to the small space between their hands and the table. The first roll is casual, almost careless. The dice clatter across the wood, bouncing softly, landing with a result that earns a quiet smile. Nothing changes. The second roll brings a little more focus, a slight lean forward, a tightening of the jaw. Around them, no one interrupts. Other guests continue drinking, talking, resting. The tavern does not pause for this moment, it simply allows it to exist within everything else. Roman games of chance were not rare, they were woven into everyday life, especially in places like this where time stretched easily and money changed hands without ceremony. Sometimes the stakes were small, a cup of wine, a loaf of bread, a single coin. Other times, they grew quietly into something more serious, though no one announces that shift in advance. It happens gradually, like the deepening of night outside the door. Across the room, another group gathers around a different game, not dice this time. Small counters carved from bone and clay are arranged into patterns on the table. One man studies the arrangement with intense concentration, while his opponent sits almost motionless, reading him as much as the game itself. These games were not only about luck, they were about patience, observation, and the ability to remain calm when chance turned against you. A tavern keeper walks nearby. Pretending not to notice, he has seen every outcome before, victory celebrated with quiet satisfaction, defeat swallowed with forced laughter, occasionally, frustration breaking through in a sharp voice before the room gently absorbs it again. He knows when to step closer, and when to remain invisible. Not every game remains harmless. There are moments when the atmosphere shifts just slightly, a hand lingers too long over the dice. A smile disappears a little too quickly, a coin is counted twice instead of once. The room does not react loudly, but it notices, always. Some patrons prefer to avoid these games entirely. They continue their conversations at other tables, sipping watered wine, watching the fire, or listening to distant laughter. For them, the tavern is not a place of risk, but of rest, yet even they cannot ignore the subtle tension that sometimes passes through the room like a brief shadow. Still, most evenings end without incident. That is the quiet truth often forgotten. For every moment of suspicion, there are many more moments of simple enjoyment, a lucky roll that earns a genuine smile, a shared laugh between opponents who decide to stop while the night is still pleasant, a game abandoned halfway through because conversation proved more interesting than competition. The tavern does not belong to chance alone. It belongs equally to those who choose to ignore it. As the night deepens, the dice games slow, fewer hands reach for them, fewer coins are placed on the table. The energy that once gathered tightly around each roll begins to dissolve back into conversation, warmth, and routine. A final set of dice is collected and tucked away into a small pouch. The table exhales. Nearby, a traveler finishes his drink and stretches tired shoulders, as if reminded that time has been passing quietly all along. Even the fire seems lower now, its glow softened into steady embers that no longer demand attention. Games, like all things in the tavern, are temporary. They rise, they fall. And then they are replaced by something gentler again, conversation returns, stories resume, silence settles comfortably between them, and once more, the tavern becomes less about winning or losing, and more about simply being present in the shared rhythm of the night. But as the final dice disappear from view, and the last wagers are forgotten, the atmosphere shifts once again toward something even quieter, the long journeys that brought travelers here from distant roads, and the strange paths that sometimes led them far beyond Rome itself. The dice have been put away, the last small coins have disappeared into worn leather pouches, and the tables slowly return to their quieter purpose. Once again, the tavern is no longer focused on chance or competition. Instead, it settles into something deeper, something more reflective, stories, not the kind written in official records or carved into stone monuments, but the kind carried by people who have walked too far to remember every detail clearly, yet far enough to make every memory feel important. It begins with a soldier. He sits slightly apart from the others, not out of isolation, but out of habit. His posture carries the quiet discipline of long training, even here in a place where no one demands it. His armor has been set aside, though the marks of travel remain, dust in the folds of his cloak, worn straps on his sandals, and the faint fatigue of miles already walked. Someone asks him a simple question, not about battles, not about victories, just, "Where have you come from?" And that is enough. The soldier exhales slowly, as though the question unlocks something he has been carrying without realizing it. He speaks of roads that stretch across provinces, of camps set beneath unfamiliar skies, of nights spent hearing distant footsteps beyond the glow of watchfires. He describes rivers crossed at dawn and villages where Latin words were not always understood. No one interrupts. Not because they are amazed, but because they understand the weight of travel in a world without certainty. Across the table sits a merchant. He nods quietly as the soldier speaks, as though recognizing familiar landscapes within the story. When his turn comes, he does not speak of battles or discipline, but of journeys equally long in their own way. Harsh sun over dry roads, sudden storms that turned paths into rivers of mud, markets where languages mixed like the colors of woven cloth. He remembers faces more than places, a baker who always gave slightly burnt bread, a harbor worker who never smiled but always helped unload crates faster than expected. Travel in the Roman world was not romantic, it was slow, unpredictable, often exhausting, yet within it, stories accumulated like layers of dust on a well-traveled cloak. At another table, a group of younger travelers listen with quiet fascination. For them, Rome is not the end of their journey, but a single point along it. Some are heading toward coastal towns, others toward inland farms or distant military posts. All of them carry uncertainty about what comes next, yet here, for a brief moment, uncertainty feels shared. The tavern becomes a map made of voices, every story adds another path, every memory sketches another road, even the tavern keeper pauses more often than usual. Not to interrupt, but to listen while passing between tables. He has heard thousands of stories over the years, yet each one still carries something slightly different, not new information, but new perspective. Outside, the night continues its slow movement. Somewhere beyond the walls, a cart creaks along stone streets, heading toward destinations unknown. A lantern sways gently in the wind as a late traveler walks alone, guided only by memory and the faint glow of distant lamps. Inside, however, no one is truly alone. Even silence feels shared here. A traveler lowers his voice as he describes a mountain pass covered in mist so thick that even sound seemed to disappear. Another adds a memory of a coastal wind that carried the scent of salt long before the sea was visible. The details are simple, but together, they form something larger, a collective understanding of distance, of effort, of movement across a vast empire that exists not only on maps, but in the lived experiences of those who cross it. As the firelight dims slightly, the atmosphere changes once again, stories become slower, pauses grow longer. Some listeners lean back, letting the words wash over them rather than trying to respond. The tavern does not demand attention, it allows it to drift. A soldier finally finishes his tale with a quiet shrug, as though the road itself has already spoken enough for him. The merchant nods in agreement. No one claps, no one cheers. Instead, a shared silence settles, respectful and complete. In that silence, something subtle happens. The distance between strangers shortens, not physically, but quietly, in understanding. And as the stories of roads and journeys begin to fade into softer conversation, the tavern prepares to shift once more, this time toward the delicate balance between rank, reputation, and the invisible lines that separated Roman society even in places meant for gathering. The stories of distant roads begin to fade slowly into softer conversation. The tavern, once filled with tales of travel and uncertainty, now settles into a quieter rhythm again. The fire burns low, casting long, gentle shadows that stretch across the worn wooden tables. Outside, Rome continues its endless contrast of noise and silence, wealth and struggle, light and darkness, and inside this small room, those differences quietly appear as well, not loudly, not openly, but in subtle details that reveal how differently Romans lived, even when sharing the same space. At one table, a man sits with a finely woven cloak draped neatly over his shoulders. The fabric is smoother than most in the room, dyed in a deeper, more expensive shade. His posture is composed, almost practiced, as if he has spent much of his life in places where how one sits matters almost as much as what one says. His cup is not clay, it is polished metal, small, simple in shape, but unmistakably refined. Nearby, another guest watches him without hostility, only curiosity. A craftsman with rough hands and a tunic worn thin at the edges. He lifts his own clay cup and takes a slow sip of watered wine, as though acknowledging the quiet distance between their worlds, yet they are seated at the same table, sharing the same light, breathing the same warm air. This is the quiet contradiction of the Roman tavern. A place where hierarchy never fully disappears, but where it becomes less rigid for a few hours. The wealthy do not always arrive with attendants here. The atmosphere is too humble for grand displays. And the ordinary guests, though aware of differences, are rarely intimidated by them in the same way they might be in marble halls or public forums. A merchant speaks softly about prices of olive oil in distant markets. His words carry confidence, but not arrogance. Across from him, a dock worker responds with practical insight about shipments and delays, offering knowledge shaped not by books, but by labor. For a brief moment, both voices hold equal weight. Elsewhere in the room, a traveling official sits slightly apart, observing rather than participating. His clothing is clean, his manner restrained. Yet even he seems less formal here than he might appear in the public spaces of Rome. The tavern relaxes even those who usually represent authority. Wine has that effect, so does distance from expectation. A servant passes between tables carrying bread. The same loaf is offered to everyone. Wealth does not change the texture of it. Hunger does not ask for status before it is satisfied, yet differences remain visible, always present. A wealthy guest might order an extra portion of meat when available. An ordinary worker might settle for bread and olives alone. One leaves a slightly larger coin on the table. Another counts each carefully before setting them down, but within these small differences, something more important quietly exists: shared experience. The sound of laughter rising from a table does not distinguish between rich and poor. It carries equally across the room. A well-told story earns the same pause in attention regardless of who speaks it. In this space, value is measured differently, not in coins alone, but in presence, in conversation, in the ability to sit through an entire evening without needing to prove anything to anyone. You notice a brief exchange between two strangers. A wealthy traveler offers a small nod of acknowledgement to a laborer who helped him earlier adjust his seat. No words are exchanged. None are needed. The gesture is simple, but it carries a quiet recognition that does not always exist in more formal places. The tavern keeper observes all of this carefully. He does not interfere, he does not correct or emphasize, he simply ensures that each person, regardless of background, receives what they ordered and a place to sit. His authority is practical, not symbolic. As the evening continues, the distinctions between guests soften slightly. Not disappearing, but becoming less important than the shared comfort of the room. A cup refilled, a story continued, a moment of laughter shared across different lives. Outside these walls, Rome remains divided by wealth, class, and reputation. Inside, those divisions still exist, but they no longer define the entire experience of the night. The fire burns lower again, and as the tavern grows quieter, attention begins to turn toward those who often speak the least in stories of Rome, the voices of those who question the very existence of places like this, and why not all Romans approved of them. The warmth of shared conversation slowly settles into a quieter tone. The tavern has softened again, its earlier contrasts between wealth and simplicity fading into calm murmurs and low lamplight. Cups are refilled more slowly now. Voices drift rather than rise. Even laughter feels more distant, as if the night itself is preparing to shift direction once more. And yet, not everyone in Roman society would have approved of this place. Outside these walls, beyond the glow of oil lamps and the comfort of wooden benches, there existed a very different perception of taverns. One shaped not by warmth or companionship, but by suspicion, caution, and concern. To some Romans, taverns represented disorder. Not because every tavern was chaotic, but because they gathered so many different lives in one place: soldiers, workers, travelers, merchants, strangers, all sitting side by side, speaking freely, sharing drink, and exchanging words without the formal structure that defined other parts of Roman life. In the eyes of certain officials and moral thinkers, that openness carried risk. At one table inside the tavern, a quiet discussion unfolds about this very idea. An older man, perhaps a minor official or someone accustomed to public order, speaks carefully while holding his cup slightly away from the table. He does not raise his voice, he does not accuse anyone directly, but his words carry a measured concern. He speaks of places where conversations grow too loose after wine, of rumors spreading faster than truth, of decisions made too quickly in the comfort of lowered judgment. Across from him, a younger listener responds more softly. He does not argue, he simply suggests that such places also offer something rare in Rome: honesty without ceremony. Still, the tension between the two views remains quiet but present. For some Romans, taverns were linked to indulgence, too much drinking, too much gambling, too much time spent away from family obligations. Moral writers of the time often warned against excessive leisure. especially when it blurred the line between relaxation and neglect of duty. In their view, a man who spent too many evenings in taverns risked losing discipline, reputation, and even respectability, and yet, those warnings did not stop the flow of people through tavern doors each evening. Because lived reality often differs from ideal expectation, you notice a group of customers near the hearth speaking more cautiously now, as though aware that certain topics might draw unwanted attention if spoken too loudly elsewhere in the city. Inside the tavern, speech feels freer, but still not without limits. Even here, people understand when to lower their voices. Not all criticism came from moral concern alone. Some came from practical fear, or officials worried about gatherings where news spread uncontrollably, where political rumors could be repeated and reshaped before reaching authority, where anonymous voices could influence opinion without oversight. In a vast empire like Rome, information was power, and taverns were one of its fastest channels. The tavern keeper moves through the room with his usual calm precision. He hears enough to understand when conversations drift toward sensitive territory. Yet he rarely intervenes unless necessary. His role is not to silence the room, but to keep it steady. Most nights, that balance holds. Occasionally, however, a sharper voice breaks through, a complaint about taxes, a frustration about distant officials, a rumor about changes in leadership somewhere far beyond the city walls. These moments pass quickly, not because they are resolved, but because the room prefers to return to comfort rather than conflict. Even disagreement grows tired in places like this. Outside, Rome continues its structured life of law, hierarchy, and formal speech. Inside, the tavern exists in a looser form of order, one that depends more on mutual restraint than on written rules, and that is precisely what made it both valued and feared, a place of connection and unpredictability. As the night deepens further, even the voices of concern begin to fade. The older man at the table finishes his thought, then simply returns to his drink. No conclusion is declared. None is needed. The conversation dissolves into silence. Around him, life continues as before. Bread is shared, wine is poured, stories resume, and slowly, the tavern returns once again to its gentler rhythm, though the awareness of outside judgment still lingers quietly beneath the surface of the night. The tension from earlier conversation slowly dissolves into the soft rhythm of the evening again. Oil lamps flicker gently along the walls, their light steadying the room after moments of quiet disagreement. Cups are refilled. Bread is passed from hand to hand. And once more, the tavern settles into its familiar balance of warmth and conversation. Yet as you observe more carefully now, another layer of this world begins to reveal itself, one that is often overlooked in many accounts of Roman life: the presence of women, not as background figures, not as silent observers, but as essential participants in the life of the tavern itself. Behind the counter, a woman moves with quiet confidence between shelves of clay cups and woven baskets. She checks the level of wine in a large amphora, then carefully adjusts a lamp hanging low from a wooden beam. Her movements are practiced, efficient, and deeply familiar with the rhythm of the room. She is not rushing, she is not waiting, she belongs here. At another table, a woman seated among travelers speaks calmly with a merchant about the journey ahead. Her tone is steady, her presence unremarkable to those who have grown used to seeing her there. In a place like this, familiarity often replaces introduction. Some women work directly within taverns, as servants, as cooks, as attendants. Their tasks shaped nearly every part of the evening experience: preparing food, pouring drinks, maintaining lamps, and ensuring that the steady flow of service never broke. But their role extended beyond labor alone. in many taverns, women were also part of the social fabric of the space. They listened to conversations while passing between tables, they remembered regular customers and their preferences, they noticed subtle changes in mood long before words were spoken aloud. In a world without formal systems of hospitality training, experience became knowledge, and observation became skill. You notice a young woman carefully carrying a tray of cups across the room. Her steps are measured to avoid spilling the watered wine, yet she still finds time to exchange a brief glance with a familiar patron. A small acknowledgement. Nothing more, but it matters. Across the room, another woman sits near the hearth, speaking softly with a group of travelers. The conversation is calm, centered around directions, local news, and advice for the road ahead. Her voice carries the quiet authority of someone who knows the city not from maps, but from lived experience. Not every woman in Rome had the same relationship with taverns. Some visited only briefly, accompanying family or stopping for a quick meal before returning home. Others worked within them regularly, shaping the atmosphere of entire evenings through their presence and labor. Unlike much of Roman life, their roles were varied, complex, and deeply tied to circumstance. The tavern keeper treats them with practical respect. He does not linger on distinctions, he simply relies on their work, just as they rely on his guidance and structure. Together, they form a quiet system that keeps the tavern alive long after the doors open each evening. As the night deepens, you begin to notice how much of the tavern's warmth depends on unseen coordination. A lamp is refilled before it dims, a table is cleaned before new guests arrive, a cup is replaced before it can break. None of these actions draw attention on their own, but together, they create the feeling that everything is effortless. In reality, it is anything but. The women working here move through the space almost like part of its architecture, present in every corner, yet rarely centered in any single moment. Their contributions are constant, but not always spoken about. Still, those who return often know a familiar smile, a remembered order, a moment of kindness offered without expectation. These small details become part of why people choose this tavern over others in the city. Outside, Rome continues its structured life of public roles and private divisions. But inside this room, identity becomes more fluid, shaped less by status and more by participation in the shared life of the evening. The tavern does not erase social reality, but it gently softens its edges. And as another quiet hour passes beneath the glow of oil lamps, you begin to understand that the life of this place depends not only on those who drink and speak within it, but equally on those who ensure that every night begins again without interruption. The night inside the tavern begins to feel different again, not quieter this time, not heavier, but brighter in spirit, as though the very air has changed with the arrival of something beyond these walls. From outside, faint sounds drift in through the doorway, distant music, scattered laughter, the echo of drums or flutes carried from the wider streets of Rome. The city itself is not at rest tonight, it is celebrating. Roman festivals often transformed entire neighborhoods. Streets filled with movement long after sunset, and taverns like this one became natural gathering points for those seeking warmth, food, or simply a place to pause between celebrations. Inside, the tavern keeper has already prepared for the shift. Extra lamps are lit, additional benches are brought closer to the walls, clay cups are stacked higher than usual, even the fire burns a little stronger, as if aware that the night will demand more of everything. The first wave arrives without warning, groups of friends, families still carrying traces of outdoor festivities, travelers drawn in by noise and light. The tavern, which earlier felt spacious and calm, now fills quickly with overlapping movement and conversation. Yet even in this busier moment, there is no true chaos. only rhythm, a different kind of order shaped by celebration instead of routine. At one table, a group of young Romans sit still, catching their breath after moving through crowded streets filled with music and torchlight. Their cheeks are slightly flushed from the night air, their voices carrying excitement that has not yet settled. They speak in quick bursts, about processions they saw earlier, about decorations hung across public squares, about the feeling of walking through Rome when it seems, for a short time, almost entirely transformed. Nearby, an older pair of travelers watches the energy with quiet amusement. They have seen many festivals before. For them, the excitement is familiar, almost cyclical. But they do not dismiss it. Instead, they allow themselves to be gently carried by it, even if only from a distance. A servant moves faster now, though still carefully. Wine is poured more frequently, bread disappears from platters more quickly than expected, yet there is a certain generosity in the way people share tonight. A cup passed from one table to another without hesitation. A seat offered to a stranger who arrived just as space became scarce. Festivals, in their own way, soften boundaries, not permanently, but long enough to feel meaningful. In one corner of the tavern, a small group begins singing softly. It is not formal music, not performed for attention, but something more spontaneous. A rhythm remembered from the streets outside, adapted imperfectly within these walls. Others join in briefly, then fade back into conversation. The song lingers for a moment longer than expected before dissolving into laughter. The tavern keeper does not interrupt. He understands that nights like this do not follow strict order. They follow atmosphere. An atmosphere cannot be controlled, only guided. Outside, the festival continues to shape the city. Lanterns sway above crowded streets. Shadows move across stone buildings in shifting patterns. The entire world seems slightly closer, as if everyone has stepped forward together for a single shared moment. Inside the tavern, that same feeling exists in miniature. Strangers sit closer than they normally would. Conversations begin without introduction. Even silence feels less private and more shared. You notice how easily people adapt to this change. A reserved guest from earlier in the evening now laughs openly at a table of strangers. A traveler who arrived alone is gradually absorbed into a larger group as if he had always belonged there. The tavern becomes less about individual stories and more about collective presence. Yet even in celebration, exhaustion eventually appears. The energy does not vanish abruptly. It slowly settles, like dust after movement. Laughter softens, music fades from voices to memory. People lean back into their seats, sipping what remains in their cups, letting the warmth of the room hold them a little longer before they return to the streets outside. Festivals in Rome are never truly contained within one place. They spill across the entire city, and when the time comes to leave, no one departs completely unchanged. As the tavern begins to ease back into a gentler rhythm, you realize that even moments of joy can reshape the meaning of a simple room like this, turning it, for a few hours, into something closer to the heart of the city itself. The festival's energy does not disappear all at once. It lingers in the air, like warmth trapped in stone even after the flames have softened. Inside the tavern, voices have begun to settle again, but the memory of celebration still hangs gently between the beams and lamps. Now, something more subtle takes over, something less visible. The senses. If you close your eyes for a moment, the tavern is no longer just a place of wood and stone. It becomes a layered experience of sound, scent, and atmosphere that defines what a Roman night truly feels like. It begins with sound, not loud sound, not music or laughter, but the constant, living background of human presence. the soft scrape of a chair being pulled across worn stone. The quiet clink of a clay cup set down a little too firmly, the low murmur of conversations blending together until individual words lose their shape and become rhythm instead of meaning. Even silence here is not empty, it carries breath, movement, expectation. From outside the doorway, Rome continues to speak in its own distant language. Footsteps echo across stone streets, a cart will roll slowly over uneven ground. Somewhere far away, a dog barks once, then falls quiet again as if reconsidering the interruption, and beneath it all, the faint pulse of a city that rarely sleeps completely. Then comes smell. The tavern holds onto its sense like memory, warm bread fresh from earlier hours, still faintly lingering in the air, olive oil, slightly earthy and rich, carried on the hands of those who prepare food, and light lamps, wine, both sharp and softened by water, drifting from half-empty cups. Smoke from charcoal fires, woven deeply into wooden beams that have absorbed it over countless evenings. Even the simple scent of clay, cups, plates, storage jars, becomes part of the atmosphere. Nothing here is isolated, every smell blends into the next, creating something that belongs only to this place. And to nights like this, a servant passes by carrying a tray of empty cups. The faint scent of bread follows them like a memory in motion. At another table, a traveler tears a piece of food slowly, releasing a warm aroma that briefly shifts the attention of those nearby before fading again into the broader mix. The tavern is not clean in a modern sense, but it is familiar. And familiarity carries its own comfort. Above all of this, the oil lamps continue to burn. Their light is not bright or sharp, it is soft, diffused, almost hesitant. It bends around smoke and wood rather than cutting through them. This creates shadows that are never fixed, always shifting slightly with every movement in the room. A hand raised to drink casts a long shape across the wall. A passing figure briefly divides the light before it closes again behind them. Nothing remains still for long. Even time seems less precise here. You begin to notice how people respond to these sensations without speaking about them. A patron leans back slightly, not because of conversation, but because the warmth from the hearth has reached a comfortable point. Another adjusts their position away from a lamp that has grown too close, not out of complaint, but habit. Someone pauses mid-sentence simply to listen to a sound from outside, then continues speaking as though that interruption was always part of the thought. The tavern teaches awareness without instruction, and in return, people adapt to it without resistance. Outside, the night of Rome continues its layered composition of sound and scent, but here inside the tavern, it becomes distilled into something more concentrated. A small world of human presence contained within four walls and a roof of smoke-darkened beams. As the evening grows later, even these sensations begin to soften. The noise fades into lower tones, the scents settle into the wood, the light becomes slower in its movement, everything begins to lean toward rest, though no one has yet decided to leave, and in that quiet transformation, you realize something simple. A Roman tavern was never only a place to eat or drink, it was a place where the city itself entered the body through sound, smell, and light, and where, for a few hours, the world outside could be felt without ever stepping beyond the door. The tavern has grown quieter again, the energy of sound and scent still lingers faintly in the air, but now it feels more distant, like an echo slowly dissolving into the wooden beams and stone walls. Oil lamps continue to burn, yet their light has softened, as if even the flames are beginning to settle into memory. Tonight, the tavern does not feel like a place of present activity, it feels like a place of echoes, stories not only spoken here, but also discovered long after the voices that created them were gone. Because Roman taverns are not only known through written history, they are also known through what remains. Archaeology has uncovered traces of these places in quiet, unassuming ways. Not grand monuments, not marble inscriptions, but everyday objects buried beneath layers of time, fragments of clay cups, charred remains of wooden counters, wall markings left by hands that never expected to be remembered. At one table inside the tavern, a traveler listens closely as someone tells a story about such discoveries, not directly about this very room, but about places like it. Excavations beneath ancient Roman streets have revealed tavern spaces filled with tools of daily life still frozen in their final moments of use. Cooking pots left near hearths. Wine amphorae sealed long ago. Countertops stained by countless evenings of service. These discoveries do not speak in words. They speak in presence, as if the past simply paused without warning. A man near the hearth leans forward slightly as the story continues. He is not a scholar, not an official, just someone listening with quiet curiosity, trying to imagine what it would feel like to uncover a room where people once laughed, argued, and rested exactly as they do now. The tavern keeper listens as well, though from a distance. He has heard versions of these stories before. They circulate through Rome in different forms, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes softened by time. One tale speaks of a tavern unearthed beneath a collapsed building where painted walls still showed faded images of drinking scenes. Figures frozen in pigment, forever mid-conversation, as if waiting for someone to return. Another tells of coins discovered scattered beneath floorboards, as though dropped in haste during an ordinary evening that never finished. Whether every detail is accurate or not matters less than the feeling they create, a sense that the ordinary can survive longer than the extraordinary. Nearby, a group of younger listeners exchange quiet remarks about these discoveries. For them, the idea that everyday life could become history feels almost unreal. They are used to thinking of Rome through emperors, armies, and grand architecture, but here, in this tavern, history feels closer, smaller, more human. A woman at a nearby table adds her own thought to the conversation. She has heard stories from travelers about pottery fragments found along old roads leading into the city. Evidence of meals once eaten on journeys that no longer exist except in memory and soil. She speaks softly, almost as if not wanting to disturb the fragile connection between past and present. And yet, the room listens. The fire in the hearth shifts slightly, sending a brief wave of warmth across the stone floor. Shadows respond, stretching, unfolding in slow motion. It feels almost as if the tavern itself is acknowledging the stories being told within it. As the conversation deepens, you begin to notice something subtle. These discoveries are not only about objects, they are about lives. Each fragment implies a moment that once mattered to someone. A cup held during conversation. A meal finished before sleep. A night not so different from this one, long ago, and in that realization, the distance between past and present begins to thin. The tavern is no longer just a setting, it becomes a continuation, a place where history is not only remembered, but quietly reenacted through everyday gestures. A cup lifted, a story shared, a moment of rest after long hours of living. As the voices soften once more, the idea of discovery begins to fade back into atmosphere, leaving behind a gentle awareness that what we call the past may simply be another version of the present, waiting beneath time. And as the fire dims slightly again, the tavern prepares to shift from stories of discovery into something even more reflective, the slow passage of time itself, and how a single evening in Rome could stretch quietly across generations in memory. The stories of discovery slowly settle into silence, the tavern once again becomes what it has always been at its core: wood, stone, firelight, and people sharing a temporary pause from the outside world. But tonight, something lingers beneath the calm, a sense that this place is not fixed in time. It is always changing, even if the changes are so slow that no single evening can fully reveal them. Across generations, Roman taverns did not remain identical. They adapted quietly, shaped by shifting cities, new rulers, changing trade routes, and the evolving needs of ordinary people, yet the essence of them remained familiar: warmth, shelter, conversation. At one table, an older man speaks softly about how taverns in his younger days felt different. Not necessarily better. Just less structured in some ways, more improvisational in others. He recalls simpler wooden counters, fewer lamps, and smaller gatherings where everyone seemed to know someone else already. Now, he says, the city feels larger even inside small rooms like this. Another listener nods, though not in disagreement. He has known only the more recent version of tavern life, slightly more organized, slightly more stable, shaped by the growing complexity of Rome itself. As the empire expanded, so too did the movement of goods, people, and ideas. Taverns reflected this change. They became more connected to trade routes, more influenced by distant provinces, more filled with travelers whose accents and customs blended into the nightly rhythm. Wine from different regions appeared more often on tables, spices carried from faraway lands occasionally entered meals, even conversations began to include references to places that earlier generations might never have heard of. Yet despite these shifts, the tavern remained grounded in something deeply consistent: human need, the need to rest after labor, the need to eat after travel, the need to speak to someone who would listen. A young traveler at the edge of the room listens quietly to these reflections. For him, Rome is not a static city of stone and tradition. It is something constantly in motion. He has seen roads under construction, buildings rising where empty ground once lay, and neighborhoods shifting in character over time. To him, change is normal, but hearing it reflected in the tavern itself gives it a different weight. Not grand history, but personal history. Near the hearth, a servant adds another piece of wood to the fire. The flame responds gently, growing slightly brighter for a moment before settling again. The motion feels symbolic, even if no one names it as such. Small adjustments creating continued warmth. The tavern keeper moves through the room with the same steady presence he always has. Yet even he seems aware of subtle differences that accumulate over years. New customers replacing old ones. Slight changes in habits. The gradual evolution of expectations. He does not resist it, he adapts, because a tavern that refuses to change eventually becomes empty, and emptiness is the only thing it cannot serve. Outside, Rome continues to evolve in ways no single observer can fully track. Streets are widened. Markets shift location. Political moods rise and fall like tides. Yet inside places like this, those changes arrive slowly, filtered through the lives of travelers and workers who carry fragments of the outside world into the room. At one table, a discussion turns to how different regions of the empire influence daily life. A merchant describes goods that were once rare but are now common. A soldier mentions how distant postings feel less isolated than they once did, thanks to improved roads and more frequent travel. Even the idea of distance itself feels slightly different than it once did, not erased, but softened. As the night continues, you begin to sense that the tavern is not just a place where people gather, it is a place where time leaves small traces of itself, in the wear of wooden benches, in the layering of stories told over years, in the familiar gestures repeated across generations without being consciously learned. Nothing here is preserved exactly as it was, but nothing is completely lost either, and that quiet balance between memory and change gives the tavern its enduring presence. As conversations begin to slow again, attention drifts toward something even deeper than change itself, the simple reality that all of these moments, no matter how ordinary, are moving toward an ending that every night in Rome eventually reaches. The tavern is quieter now than it has been all evening, not empty, not abandoned, but softened, as if the night itself has finally exhaled after a long and crowded breath. The oil lamps still glow, though more dimly than before. Their light no longer pushes into every corner, it simply rests there, gently, like memory held in place. Outside, Rome is deep in its final hours of darkness. A few distant sounds still drift through the streets, but even those feel tired now. The city that once pulsed with movement, festivals, arguments, stories, and chance encounters is slowly surrendering to dawn. Inside the tavern, only a handful of guests remain, not because anything ended abruptly, but because everything naturally faded into stillness. You sit among them, observing how the night changes its final shape. At one table, a traveler stares into his nearly empty cup, not out of sadness, but reflection. The kind that comes when time feels slightly stretched, and ordinary hours begin to feel larger than they should. Nearby, a servant quietly clears away broken bread and empty cups. There is no urgency in the movement now, only completion. Each object is handled carefully, as if the evening itself deserves respect in its final moments. The tavern keeper stands near the counter for a longer time than usual. He does not rush the closing of the night. Instead, he allows it to end at its own pace. The way he has seen countless nights end before this one, because for him, this is not a single evening, it is part of a cycle, a rhythm repeated across years, across generations. Roman tavern life did not survive because it was remarkable in a dramatic sense. It survived because it was consistent, because night after night, people needed the same simple things: warmth after cold streets, food after labor, company after solitude, a place where their names did not matter as much as their presence. You begin to understand that what happened inside these walls was never truly forgotten. It simply never needed to be remembered in grand ways. It lived in repetition, in habits passed from one person to another without instruction, in the way a cup is offered, in the way a seat is shared, in the way silence is accepted without discomfort. The last conversations of the night are now barely audible. Words soften into pauses. Pauses stretch into stillness. Someone rises, adjusts their cloak, offers a quiet nod, and steps into the dark streets outside. No farewell speech is needed. The door closes gently behind them, and the tavern feels even calmer. You realize that this place was never only about what happened inside it at any single moment. It was about everything that led people here, and everything that awaited them afterward. The streets, the homes, the long walks between both. The tavern existed as a bridge between those worlds, not permanent, not monumental, but necessary. A place that held people for just long enough to make the rest of their lives feel more bearable. As the final lamps are adjusted, the light shifts into its softest form yet. Shadows are no longer moving quickly. They settle, as if deciding to remain still for a while. The air itself feels slower, heavier with quiet understanding, and in that stillness, you begin to sense something almost invisible, that the real history of Rome was not only written in battles, emperors, or marble monuments, it was also written in nights like this, in rooms like this, in conversations that never reached official records, in people who came, stayed for a while, and then disappeared back into the city without leaving names behind, the tavern keeper finally extinguishes one of the last lamps. The flame fades gently, without resistance, not an ending, just transition. Outside, the first hint of dawn begins to touch the edges of the sky, though it has not yet reached the streets below. Inside, the tavern remains in its final state of calm, a place between night and morning, between memory and continuation, and as you take in the last traces of warmth and shadow, there is a quiet realization that lingers beyond the story itself, that even forgotten nights like this were once someone's entire world.